Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. So Novartis appreciates the perspective shared by the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review in its draft report on the comparative clinical effectiveness and health economic value of inclisiran, an investigational cholesterol-lowering treatment. Having reviewed the report, we believe that there are assumptions that ICER could revisit. In particular, the cost-effectiveness model assumes the usage of inclisiran only on top of ezetimibe and statins in ASCVD patients. This is an idealized scenario, and it is inconsistent with real-world practice, where only approximately 4.2% of ASCVD patients receive ezetimibe, and also on the way that inclisiran was studied. In Orient 10 and 11 clinical trials, inclisiran was studied on top of maximum tolerated statin dose, and although ezetimibe was allowed in the trial, it was not required. So only about 9.9% of the patients in Orient 10 and 7.1% of the patients in Orient 11 actually were receiving ezetimibe. Consequently, the model assumes a lower LDL-C level in the real world at baseline, a reduction that goes from 104.97 milligrams per deciliter to 88.8 milligrams per deciliter. This assumption implies an underestimation of the total number of CV events that could be avoided by inclisiran in the ICER model. It is mentioned in the reply to the Novartis comments that the baseline LDL level is varied in sensitivity analysis, but the report offers no in-depth discussion of the implications of this assumption. In the cost-effectiveness analysis developed by Novartis, increasing the baseline LDL-C value from 88.8 milligrams per deciliter that ICER assumed to the 104.97 milligrams per deciliter observed in real life resulted in approximately 30% decrease in the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio of inclisiran. So the assumption of having inclisiran used only after ezetimibe, we believe undervalues the assessment of inclisiran. The report also states that the model assumed the same adherence to the interventions as observed in the clinical trials to reflect the efficacy estimates from the trials. In a response to Novartis comments, ICER mentioned that differential adherence is not necessarily assumed. So Novartis would actually welcome some additional clarity on how adherence to therapy is being considered in the analysis. We also believe that omitting the role and impact of treatment discontinuation in the analysis both does not reflect real-world patient behavior and also can have a large impact in the results. Finally, in certain areas of the report, there is not yet complete clarity on how some parameters were derived to populate the model, namely in the methods used. So some of the responses provided to the Novartis questions were very useful and allowed us to better understand the rationale and impact of some of the choices that were made. But there are still some areas where the report can improve, such as on how much CV mortality varies according to the prior history of cardiovascular events and time since last event, on the reporting of the rates of some events, such as stroke and cardiovascular mortality, and lastly, on the reporting on the proportion of patients with different comorbid conditions, such as diabetes, in the population used at baseline. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Dr. Qazi or anyone from ICER, if you would like to respond.
Yes, I can quickly jump in and say, thank you. The feedback we got from Novartis was really helpful, and we were happy to share the model as part of the transparency initiative with Novartis beforehand. So we hope that you've had a chance to kick the tires and examine the model inputs more carefully. Your point about implications for of LDL are real, and I think that it was a position that we took that we think that ezetimibe, the value of the drug should be determined over and above background ezetimibe therapy. And I should say that, the MACE rate is still, regardless, the MACE rate was calibrated to the general population of 5 per 100 person years, and which is a very reasonable MACE rate for individuals with secondary prevention. So I'd be curious to hear what your baseline MACE rate is, because this is already higher than what was seen in the PCSK9 trials. And then finally, the question of adherence is open in the sense that our model assumes that individuals receive the therapy for the duration. They have both the costs and the effects as was seen in the trial. the real world adherence, whether getting a shot every 6 months is different from giving yourself the shot every 2 weeks, is an open-ended question, and we'd love to see data from the real world once they're available. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to the next presentation, and that's Dr. Michael Louie. Please introduce yourself and if you have any conflicts.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. My name's Mike Louie, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Clinical Development and Pharmacovigilance at Esperion. I'd like to thank ICER for the opportunity to comment on its high cholesterol analysis. As a practicing internist, I treated dyslipidemia on a daily basis. I also manage patients suffering from devastating cardiovascular events caused by high cholesterol, such as heart attacks and strokes. The risk of cardiovascular events remains unacceptably high for many patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or ASCVD. Bempedoic acid, trade name Nexletol, and the fixed-dose combination with ezetimibe called Nexlizet were the first oral LDL-C-lowering medications approved for patients with ASCVD and heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia in 20 years. Nexletol provides an additional 18 to 25% LDL-C reduction, whereas Nexlizet provides an additional 38% reduction. Both have safety profiles generally comparable to placebo. Nexletol and Nexlizet are priced at parity. This allows HCPs and patients to choose the most appropriate medication to get to LDL-C goal without needing to consider price differences. Regarding ICER's evidence report, there are 3 main points I'd like to comment on. First, maximally tolerated statin plus 100% ezetimibe use is not an appropriate comparator arm for Nexlizet. Recent clinical trials and real-world data, as well as ICER's own NHANES analysis, show that ezetimibe use in the US currently ranges from 2 to 7%. Forcing all ASCVD patients to step through ezetimibe would result in delaying many from getting to LDL-C goal. And why does this matter? Delays in getting to LDL-C goal result in patients suffering unnecessary events, including CV death. 2 large retrospective studies of ASCVD patients showed that delaying access to PCSK9 inhibitors led to significantly increased risk of recurrent CV events. ICER notes that it does not make a recommendation for step therapy in all cases. However, the ICER comparator arm assumes a mandatory step edit, which, if replicated in real life, will result in patients having unnecessary CV events. ICER's model should account for the fact that an ezetimibe step edit is not appropriate for ASCVD patients who require more LDL-C reduction than is provided by ezetimibe to get to goal. In fact, if the comparator arm in ICER's analysis is changed to maximally tolerated statin plus 10% ezetimibe use, Nexlizet is cost-effective in the overall ASCVD population with an ICER below 100,000 per quality, and even more so in statin-intolerant patients with an ICER below 50,000 per quality. A sensitivity analysis of the comparator arm that varied the percent usage of ezetimibe would have produced cost-effectiveness results informed by real-world prescribing and therefore of more utility to clinical decision-making. My second point is regarding the assumed mean baseline LDL-C of 89 milligrams per deciliter based on the assumption of 100% ezetimibe use. This LDL-C level does not reflect real-world levels in ASCVD patients, the majority of whom are not on ezetimibe. In 6 recent phase 3 trials of patients with ASCVD and LDL-Cs greater than or equal to 70, baseline LDL-C levels ranged from 102 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. The reduction in CV risk associated with a lipid-lowering therapy is proportional to the absolute decrease in LDL-C achieved. By using an inappropriately low baseline LDL-C, the ICER analysis underestimates Nexlizet's absolute LDL-C reduction and therefore underestimates its potential CV risk reduction and its cost effectiveness. Finally, since ICER's economic assessment evaluated Nexlizet, the voting questions on clinical evidence and contextual considerations should focus on Nexlizet rather than Nexletol. Nexlizet is priced at parity with Nexletol and allows patients to avoid having to take 2 separate pills and pay 2 copays. On behalf of Esperion, I appreciate the opportunity to share our feedback. We strongly believe that any cost-effectiveness analysis should represent real-world clinical practice and should not inadvertently support limited access to innovative treatment options that are needed by many patients with ASCVD. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Again, Dr. Qazi or anyone from Kaiser, would you like to respond?
I'd be happy to take it. Again, Mike, thank you for that feedback. We really appreciate the feedback we've got from Marion, and again, we're thrilled that you were participating in the transparency initiative where you were able to look at the model carefully. Maybe I'll step, I mean, I could say the same thing, which is we're not making a recommendation for step therapy, but I'm going to take a step back and help us think through this in a different way. If we look at the real world use, you know, at least a third of the patients are not on statins either, not related to statin therapy intolerance. Patients don't take their medications. The fact that they're not on statin therapy does not mean that when we're evaluating a new therapy should be against a placebo. We wouldn't do that. And I'm not sure why we're assuming complete statin use and not complete ezetimibe use. We're trying to disconnect the clinical recommendation of step therapy, which is a very much in Dr. Virani and the guideline committee's court, from the economic evaluation, which is how much should we pay for a new therapy if it were used as intended. And so that was the approach. The LDL estimate that we have is from NHANES. And again, you're right that it assumes perfect adherence. Assumes total ezetimibe use, so we've corrected for that. But we actually received feedback in the first round of the draft report that our assumptions of LDL cholesterol from clinicians that they were too high. So I understand from your perspective that you think they should be higher, and I see why, but they reflect both what's seen in NHANES and what we were guided to by our clinicians. Your question about copays is very valid, and it's something that that the committee can look at as they're evaluating the evidence. There is both less bill burden and fewer copays in our environment, with the caveat that ezetimibe is largely generic at this point and has a generic copay rather than a brand name copay.
Thank you very much. And I believe this is a point that I'm sure Steve is taking notes of for the policy roundtable. Excellent. We're going to go next to public comments and discussion. And we're going to start by Ms. Andrea Bear. Again, please introduce yourself. And if you have any conflicts, you have 3 to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here with you all. My disclosure is the same as it was in the beginning. And I would like to let you know that I come to you today on behalf of the 102 million Americans with high cholesterol, their families, caregivers, employers, and friends. My comments today are designed to bring the patient voice to the table and present to you the real-world impact on decisions that will be made here today. You've heard the scientists speak and listen to the data being crunched, all to determine the cost effectiveness of these medications. But my job is to bring the patient to life for you. You see, innovation means nothing without access. If a patient cannot access the treatment that could save their life, they could die. We've seen today how data is studied and how numbers are crunched to come up with the perfect formula to make a decision of whether a medication is cost effective or not. Unfortunately, just because something looks good on paper or doesn't mean it's good in the real world patient. There's a high burden of hidden costs to not treating. When innovation isn't accessible, this is what happens. Patients have critical and costly events, such as a stroke. They become debilitated by their disease. Their caretakers struggle and have to quit their jobs to care for them. Their families are burdened by a preventable illness. Employers lose employees, and healthcare costs of those patients rise. When one patient gets sick, he or she is not the only one affected. Prevention is always less expensive than treatment to the patient, the family, and the healthcare system. A patient trusts their healthcare provider, and together they should have the ability to make a shared decision about a treatment regimen without worry that the best treatment for them isn't accessible because their life isn't worth the amount of money it's going to cost. And honestly, with all due respect, this is what we're talking about today. Is the cost of a medication worth it? A flaw in this model that's being used is that individual patients are not reflected in the model. Not everyone can fit into a predetermined box on paper. Every patient is different, and treatments that may work for one does not work for another. So the beauty of having choices is that doctors and patients can work together to find a plan that works for them. And it would be ideal if all treatments were the most cost effective, but sometimes they're not. But always that decision should be made by a patient and their healthcare provider. And that brings me to this point. Let's be clear, ICER has a huge impact on how payers structure and improve medications. ICER can literally be a deciding factor of whether patients have access to their treatment or not. It was noted after the PCSK9 and Vasipa reviews. Payers will use this information that ICER puts out to deny treatment that could be life-saving to patients strictly based on their cost effectiveness. You see, doctors aren't not prescribing the medication because it doesn't work. They're not prescribing these medications because they know their patients can't access it. And that's not only sad, it's harmful. So I just want, as you are considering your vote today, please take time and consider the patient voice and how the implications of these votes will go in limiting access. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bear. Very important points. Definitely will keep all this in mind. Why don't we go to the next presenter, Dr. Sethbaum.
Hi, first I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today. I also have to say I didn't know about the 5 minutes, and my comments are 6 minutes. I hope you give me that opportunity. Let me begin with my relevant disclosures. I have served on advisory boards for both Novartis and Esperion. I've been a speaker for Esperion, and I've conducted numerous clinical trials with both inclisiran and bempedoic acid. I am a past president of the American Society for Preventive Cardiology, and although I am speaking today on my own and not the Society's behalf, this leadership position is highly relevant. The Society's mission to promote the prevention of cardiovascular disease and advocate for the preservation of cardiovascular health has been my personal and professional goal for the last 20 years. Importantly, I spent the first part of my career almost exclusively treating, not preventing cardiovascular disease. In cardiac catheterization laboratories, I tried to manage atherosclerosis long after its inception, often during the throes of life-threatening and permanently devastating events. Recognizing the futility of this Band-Aid approach, I later turned my full attention to cardiovascular disease prevention, believing that with more strategic efforts on the part of clinicians and patients, combined with successful innovations by pharmaceutical companies, there would come a time when we would truly prevent the events that I had battled during my early years as a physician. Consistent with the tenets of ASPC, I've maintained that heart attack, stroke, and even cardiovascular death can all be reduced or even averted. Rigorous research and development has indeed produced effective therapeutics. Unfortunately, though, cost has recently become an unexpected and unprecedented barrier to access for scientifically validated and FDA-approved therapies. This year in the US, well over 1 million coronary events will occur. Over $555 billion will be spent on cardiovascular disease, and 800,000 people will suffer a stroke, with 90% of these being considered avertible had proper preventive strategies been in place. No one can dispute the need for new therapeutics that can effectively decrease the burden of cardiovascular disease in America. When these drugs do become available, in order for them to work, though, patients must be able to get them. Today, you are hearing from various clinicians, patients, and advocacy leaders as we are all very concerned that another PCSK9 inhibitor debacle might be in our future. Your voice is very, very powerful, and I am hopeful that your final document will reflect and fairly apply to real-world patients. After all, they are the ones who will be at the receiving end of either easy and appropriate access to these medications or the opposite. I am most concerned about some of your assumptions, as they will clearly influence your findings. In your model, 100% of patients are on both a high-intensity statin and ezetimibe. Most real-world studies show quite a different picture. A 2019 American Heart Association poster by Nehar Desai revealed that only 44% of patients 1 year out from an MI, we're taking high intensity statins. We must remember that this is our highest risk cohort, patients within a year of an acute coronary syndrome. If these individuals are not using high intensity statins, imagine how the rest of the secondary prevention population is doing. Further, assuming that 100% of very high risk patients are taking ezetimibe appears almost to be a typographical error. In Fourier, a 27,564 patient cardiovascular outcome trial of very high risk patients, only 5.2% were taking ezetimibe. We know that our best managed patients are in trials such as this. How then can we posit that 100% of real world patients are treated so much better? Making matters worse, in the real world, payers paid only 65% of claims for ezetimibe in patients with familial hypercholesterolemia and an LDL greater than 190 milligrams per deciliter on maximally tolerated statins. Getting payers to approve and then pay for such medications is a real issue that must be included in any honest cost-effectiveness model. Further, regarding the assumption that real-world very high-risk patients have an average LDL of 88.8 milligrams per deciliter, we only need look again at Fourier to see this cannot be so. The superbly treated patients in this study had a baseline median LDL of 92. Finally, there is ample evidence that assumptions that MACE is only 5.06 per 100 patient years and statin intolerant prevalence only 10% are gross underestimates among real-world patients. The crux of this matter is that your findings will ultimately greatly influence the care of real patients. Personally, I have treated high-risk patients who experienced strokes and MIs after being wrongfully denied PCSK9 inhibitors. We have published that 63% of patients with FH and established ASCVD, an undeniably high-risk group, were denied coverage for PCSK9 inhibitors. Additionally, we demonstrated that adverse outcomes do indeed occur more frequently among such high-risk patients who are denied PCSK9 inhibitors. In 2000,
time is up. I'm sorry, we have to.
I have 15 seconds, I promise you. 15 seconds.
Last sentence, please.
Okay, additionally, we have demonstrated adverse outcomes do indeed occur more frequently among such high-risk patients who are denied PCSK9 inhibitors. In 2015 and beyond, payers ran with your PCSK9 findings and left no holds barred in constructing obstacles for patient access to these vital drugs. Even after the drug's 60% price decrease, we still find ourselves battling to get our high-risk patients on treatment. I'm afraid we'll have similar matters to confront if your current assumptions are used when you model cost effectiveness of these two excellent novel lipid-lowering therapies, and I beseech you to reconsider your estimates and make them more consistent with real-world data. Thank you very much for the extra 30 seconds as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the next presenter. And John Kleimer, please introduce yourself. And we are going to stick to the 5 minutes maximum.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I apologize that my camera, although the camera shows it's working, it doesn't seem to be appearing on screen. So I apologize for that. Well, first, thank you for this opportunity to address you. I speak on behalf of the National Forum for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention, which is a nonprofit hub for public-private collaboration to improve cardiovascular health, and the Value and Access Steering Committee. Committee members represent patients, providers, public health, payers, purchasers, and pharma and biotech companies. The committee provides consensus input to ICER on various reviews. The first point I would like to address is ezetimibe as a comparator. The analytic model should accurately reflect what happens in the real world. This is not the case with use of ezetimibe. For example, NHANES data show that only 4.2% of people with prior ASCVD and LDL-C greater than 70 on statin therapy take ezetimibe. Yet ICER's model assumes that all patients take ezetimibe. The National Forum and Value and Access Steering Committee support evidence-based medicine. We recognize that the ACC/AHA guidelines for management of blood cholesterol call for ezetimibe to be used before more aggressive therapies. However, two significant factors should affect the weight that current modeling gives to the guidelines. One, the guidelines added ezetimibe as a step through for PCSK9 inhibitors because of the high cost of those therapies. The guidelines explicitly refer to mid-2018 list prices before the manufacturers cut the cost of PCSK9 inhibitors by about half. The price cut significantly affected cost effectiveness. Second, the data tell us, all of us, that real-world use of ezetimibe is low, below 7%. We understand that clinicians ICER consulted said they would likely consider ezetimibe as the first treatment. However, clinicians consulted by the National Forum said that because many patients with high residual CV risk and or high LDL-C will need more than ezetimibe, many physicians will bypass that and go straight to a more potent therapy. Therefore, ezetimibe is not a realistic comparator for either treatment being considered. Furthermore, if more people benefit from ezetimibe's lipid-lowering power when it is combined with bempedoic acid, either because more clinicians will prescribe it in the combination pill or because patients are more likely to take a combination pill, LDL-C reduction is achieved, and it benefits cardiovascular health. This is sound justification for the value-based price of bempedoic acid to include the lipid-lowering benefits of ezetimibe. The second point is the baseline LDL-C level among patients on maximally tolerated statin and ezetimibe used in the real model. For the reasons I have just covered, this is not grounded in real-world practice. The value of 88.8 milligrams per deciliter is significantly lower than baseline LDL-C levels in phase 3 trials. A more accurate or realistic baseline to use would be the population average without applying the effects of ezetimibe to the entire population. Using the lower LDL-C level of 88.8 negatively impacts the cost-effectiveness analysis. As the primary goal of high cholesterol treatment is absolute lowering of LDL-C, starting at an artificially lower number in effect lowers the ceiling on the impact that can be achieved with both inclisiran and bempedoic acid. One option ICER might consider is an additional stratified analysis by base LDL-C. Many clinicians are used to LDL-based thresholds. Looking at cost effectiveness in those with LDL-C in 70 to 79 versus 100 to 129 versus 130 and above would be useful. The other challenge is that ICER uses LDL-C reduction to estimate treatment efficacy. These estimates should be updated after cardiovascular outcome trial data are released. Finally, high-risk patients need effective therapeutic options. As ICER's review and Dr. Lin's presentation show, bempedoic acid and inclisiran are effective in reducing LDL-C in high-risk populations. They provide alternative treatment options to patients in society to address the most prevalent and costly chronic conditions impacting Americans today. Payers who are on the Value and Access Steering Committee have reported that multiple payers currently have bempedoic acid on Tier 2 formularies without restrictions. They have determined it is cost effective. There's concern that were ICER to judge its cost effectiveness based on modeling assumptions that do not obtain in the real world, it could open the door for formulary changes that would have the effect of reducing treatment options for patients. And as we heard from Ms. Bear, those options are essential.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to the next presenter, Ms. Pat Meredith.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you for letting me share my cholesterol story. I was raised in a family where watching one's health was not a primary focus. My mother was a heavy smoker, moderate drinker, and rarely exercised. Her father and she had high cholesterol and high blood pressure. My father died due to alcoholism. My two older brothers have high cholesterol, as I do, and have had issues on and off with their blood pressure, depending on their lifestyle choices. Cholesterol is an issue for both of them, and I believe neither of them are taking statins due to their concerns about the medication. Because of my family history and my parents' lifestyle, I realized I needed to live my life differently. My journey of health started early in school, being active in team sports and in running. After college, I moved to Vermont to ski. I worked to play, as a lot of young people do when they move to a resort town. However, I chose to stay because I did not want to give up this lifestyle. As I got older, I quit drinking alcohol, I stopped smoking, and I increased my cardiovascular activities. My passions are hiking, backpacking, running, biking, and kayaking, and an occasional golf game. Vermont is the perfect playground for me to do all I can for my health and have fun doing it. In my 60s, I added functional strength training and yoga to my physical routine. I eat mostly a plant-based diet and I'm careful about what I eat. Despite taking these precautions to maintain my health, my cholesterol was extremely high and could not be controlled by my careful diet and exercise. I was prescribed statins to lower my cholesterol, but did not tolerate the statin medication. I had knee pain, severe leg cramps, muscle weakness to the point where I could not exercise the way that I wanted. However, very alarming for me was the brain fog that I experienced from the statin. Having a mother, a grandfather, and a husband who lived with and died from Alzheimer's disease, I found this side effect very disturbing. I was in a dilemma in what do I choose, my cognition or my cardiovascular health? Statins took away from me what I love to do, which is being active and clear-headed. Having spoken to my PCP about the side effects I experienced, I was dismissed. In regard to my brain fog, he indicated that mental fog wasn't a side effect and not to worry. In regard to my muscle weakness, I was told it wasn't a big deal. There had to be a better way for me to deal with my cholesterol. These experiences led me to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center in New Hampshire, where I found a lipid specialist. I felt an immediate kinship with my doctor, for she indicated that I had familial hypercholesterolemia, and though I was doing everything I could, my lifestyle would not be enough to change my cholesterol numbers. I tried statins once again under her care and found I could still not tolerate the medication. We spoke of alternatives and possible side effects and agreed upon a different course of treatment. My total cholesterol, HDL, and LDL numbers are now within normal limits with no side effects with my current medication. My past experience highlights the need for a thorough review of side effects and adverse reactions of medication with a patient. When asked questions about medication, side effects were glossed over, and my provider talked only about the effectiveness of this medication of statins. Also, patient care is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It takes conversation and cooperation between provider and patient to build trust and find a workable solution to the cholesterol problem. I work with my lipid specialist to find alternatives to statins and certainly appreciate her ability to hear and acknowledge my concerns. Thanks for letting me tell my story.
Thank you very much, Ms. Meredith, for sharing your story. We appreciate it. Thank you. We're going to go to the next presenter, Ms. Leah Parker.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Great. My name is Lee Parker, and I'm a heart patient. In 2003, I was diagnosed with aortic stenosis as a result of a congenital heart defect. In 2016, I had open heart surgery to replace my aortic valve. Following my surgery, I began statin therapy because my LDL was over 100. I'd been given a gift with a new aortic valve, and I wanted to do everything I could to reduce my risk of heart disease. Everyone in my family currently takes a statin: my mom, my dad, my brother, and my sister. And just like my family members, my LDL improved when I started taking atorvastatin. The medication did exactly what it was supposed to do. It brought my LDL in range. But by the end of 2016, my liver enzymes were elevated, and I was sent to a liver specialist. Over the course of the year, my liver numbers continued to be a problem, and they wanted to do a liver biopsy. I felt increasing muscle stiffness and pain in my legs. I had difficulty standing up from a chair without support, and my primary care doctor offered a referral to a rheumatologist. I felt like all I did was go to the doctor, and each time there was something else for me to be concerned about. We decided before I took these next steps, I should consult my cardiologist. He suggested that I stop taking the statin just to see what would happen. Right away, my liver enzymes returned to normal, and my energy and activity levels soared because I no longer experienced the muscle pain and weakness. I could enjoy exercise again. I was able to sleep through the night and do all the things that I loved. So while I felt great, my LDL went up. My doctor does my blood work every quarter. She suggested that I talk to my cardiologist about trying a different medication. My cardiologist prescribed ezetimibe. My liver numbers stayed good, but my cholesterol was still high. Since then, I have tried 3 other statin brands. I've tried taking my statin just 3 times a week, and I've tried reduced dosages. My cholesterol would go down, but the pain always came back. I was ashamed to go out with friends because I didn't have the strength to stand up from the dinner table. I shortened my daily walks because they hurt. I took Tylenol and used a heating pad often. I wondered if the medication was actually causing long-term damage. I mean, pain means something is wrong, but high cholesterol isn't good either. I planned a Disney World trip with our kids and grandkids last February, and I decided I was not going to be physically limited. I stopped taking my statin in January in preparation for the trip. My son-in-law says the way to navigate Disney is to tie a rope around Grammy and hang on tight. I'm the one with the energy to wear out the kids, and I was bound and determined to be able to climb out of the rides without embarrassing my granddaughters. Without the statin, I easily led my family on 25,000 plus step days, and I was pretty graceful climbing out of the rocket ship at Space Mountain. I walk every single day, rain or shine, never missing a day for the past 5 years. And I've been a vegetarian for over 20 years. I love living my life. I love my daily walk. I love being able to run up and down the stairs, doing things in my house. I love jumping on the trampoline with my 8-year-old granddaughter and dancing in the living room with my 12-year-old granddaughter. I also want to reduce my cholesterol. It feels as though I have 3 choices. Take a statin and live a painful, sedentary life, not take a statin and increase my risk of heart disease, or look for something new. I'm still searching for the answer. I'm going to keep working with my team of doctors to find that answer because I'm grateful that I have doctors who know who I am, who are focused on patient care and are willing to look for a treatment that'll work for me. I can't imagine that going on and off statins is a very good way to manage this condition. My grandmother died of a heart attack and she was very fit and active. My dad, who's now 80, suffered a heart attack and a stroke. So I know my family's history. I can't ignore my cholesterol. I also want to live life to the fullest. I don't want to choose between a long life and a good life. I want both. Please consider these new therapies for patients. I've asked my medical providers to help me find the answer, and now I'm asking you to consider offering these new medication options. I know people just stop taking statins when they feel pain. We need a solution that'll work for those of us who experience statin intolerance, but still have a lot of active years left. Thanks so much for hearing my story.
Thank you very much, Ms. Parker. Again, really appreciate you sharing your story. Clearly hearing from the patients who have side effects, potentially from statin, and we'll keep that in mind. I'm going to go to the last presenter, Ms. Catherine Wildman. And for everybody, we are going to postpone our lunch break to 12:15. Catherine, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Wildman. I'm the founder and the CEO of the FH Foundation. We are a nonprofit research and advocacy organization dedicated to improving the diagnosis and treatment of those who are born with a metabolic disorder that causes severe hypercholesterolemia and premature cardiovascular disease, familial hypercholesterolemia, as you heard mentioned today. I really want to thank all of you for the opportunity to comment today on the report made by ICER on therapies for high cholesterol. We are grateful that ICER has recognized the important public health need for additional treatment options to improve outcomes for high-risk individuals. Today, we're wrestling with the question of how to value therapies that can further reduce the LDL cholesterol burden on patients at high risk. Lowering LDL is the single most modifiable risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Even now, as we live through this pandemic, cardiovascular disease continues to kill and sicken more people than any other disease. The FH Foundation really appreciates ICER's mission to bring data, analytics, and a consortium of stakeholders to weigh in on the question of value for novel therapies. And I have to say, we have witnessed ICER make substantive efforts to assure the accuracy of the inputs and the quality of the assumptions. They have a stellar team, and the FH Foundation is grateful to have had the real opportunity to share data, medical expertise, and the experiences of people living with ASCVD and FH in this most recent report. The assumptions in the model are valuable information. They provide us valuable information, but they are still imperfect as they're based on available published data. We've heard extensively from several people that the assumption that 100% of the patients would be taking statins and or ezetimibe is unrealistic. I think another assumption that is misleading is that the quality of life goes back to perfect or almost perfect after a heart attack or another cardiovascular event. I have familial hypercholesterolemia. I survived a heart attack at the age of 39. Contrary to the assumptions made in this report about the quality of life after a heart attack, I can attest from personal experience and from the experience of thousands of men and women who are members of the FH Foundation that life does not return to its former state. Having a heart attack, bypass surgery, getting multiple stents, or having a stroke, becoming a cardiovascular disease patient in whatever form changes your life. How you vote today on the key questions presented to you will matter to families across the United States, because we have created a system that is inherently challenging for Americans who are sick or in need of care to navigate. And let's face it, the United States healthcare incentives are not aligned across stakeholders. Healthcare industry is a big business, whether it is payers, pharmaceutical companies, or health systems. But every stakeholder in healthcare has the responsibility that can never be forgotten. We have to do the right thing for the people that we serve. Science has clearly elucidated the role of LDL cholesterol management in preventing cardiovascular disease. The sooner we lower someone's high cholesterol, and the more we lower someone's cholesterol, the further we take them out of harm's way. We must recognize that for some people, including those with familial hypercholesterolemia, multiple therapies are required to reach recommended safe levels of LDL. As the report calls out, the FH population is at extremely high risk, a population that crosses the threshold for cardiovascular disease on average 2 decades earlier than the rest of the population. I see that I'm running out of time, unfortunately. I would implore all of you, to the manufacturers, the companies here, to find available ways, as you've heard from my other colleagues, to make sure that your recommendations do not have unintended consequences that pose barriers to care, and to own the fact that you have established yourself as a leader in the field, and therefore the decisions you make will be incorporated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wildman. Okay, with this, we've heard about the evidence. We've heard from clinical experts, patient experts, and from the public and manufacturer. Thank you so much to everyone who presented. This was very informative. I would like to hand it to Steve for maybe a few minutes of discussion before lunch. Steve, to you.
Actually, I don't. Thank you, Reem. And I completely agree with the comments about the quality of the comments that we just received. And many of them are issues that we have heard from folks before about and wrestled with ourselves. I know you heard Qazi react to some of them. These will come back again as we talk about the issues about clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness, but obviously even more perhaps when we do the policy roundtable and talk more about how stakeholders, how they view the options for translating this into aspects of pricing, coverage, patient engagement, et cetera. So I look forward to that very much. We will, I think, be able to take almost the full lunch break. It still was only 45 minutes to start with. But if we come back at 12:45 Central Time, that's 1:45 Eastern, that should be fine. And at that point, again, we'll lead right into the further deliberation and the votes. So everybody make sure that please on the CEPAC, come back a minute or two before 12:45 Central, and we'll see you all then. Thank you.